Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Babbling Iron show with myself and Mike. And today, again, more interesting news coming out that West Ham could be looking to appoint a director of football this summer, a summer of change. And there's a few candidates that have come out which are particularly interesting and caught, especially your eye, Mike. So we're going to get into those, break down what this means for the club, what it means for the likes of Mark Noble, and who is pushing this. So, Mike, just to start with, this is where the kind of story came from. Jacob Steinberg on Twitter, stating that West Ham are identifying candidates to take over the director of football role this summer. The position will fit alongside Mark Noble as the sporting director, as the West Ham board is kind of making this move after last summer's unconvincing signings in their terms. And just to start with off of that, I know we've touched on the whole thing before, but just very briefly, do you think it's a justified approach to be appointing director of football based on what Rob Newman's done this summer, as a reason for this to be happening?
Assigning a director of football, I think, is right. In light of Rob Newman, no. I think Rob Newman should stay in his role essentially as chief or head of scouting and work underneath a director of football. He's done this before. It was the same at Man City. He worked under a director of football. He is obviously very much astute. Now, whilst the club has said the signings haven't been successful, I think that it's a very convenient way in which to offset blame on what has been a terrible season. The fact of the matter is they need the manager at the moment because of what's coming. So they're not going to be calling out saying that he's been absolutely terrible. They're going to call out that maybe signings haven't hit the ground running and we haven't gone to the level that they projected at the start of the season.
Sure.
So it's a convenient truth to say it's on Newman and the signings.
We saw Mark Noble come in as sporting director. Again, a role himself, he said he has no experience really in it, and he's kind of come in on the basis of just being involved in the club and developing an understanding. So on that side of things, the director of football is being brought in to help that, as the kind of article states as well. It's felt that bringing in this director of football would help the sporting director, Mark Noble. Obviously, he was appointed back in January, and the board have been impressed with Noble, with how he's settled. But it has been recognised that he just doesn't have enough support or experience right now for that role to be doing it by himself. So effectively, what bringing in a director of football would do would relinquish some of that heavy burden off of Noble, allow him to focus on the things he is good at, which is the academy, bringing through those young players, understanding of the football club. And it allows someone like a director of football to come in to kind of take over the bigger picture stuff, if you want to kind of label it as that. So on that basis, it's a smart move, right?
It is a smart move on the basis of the pretext it's been put underneath. It is a smart move, an intelligent business decision in which to add experience and essentially a way of mentoring, guiding Noble into potentially then taking that role on himself, say after that director of football's time expires, but also it adds, as we've been saying for many a time, it puts a business level between the manager, the board, but it also means that it gives a level of continuity regardless who the manager is. And that way you can remove managers as and when you need to, because that person is going to be in charge of what then comes with the club. The only issue I have is the fact that we've had one director of football in the past who had a year, or about 18 months really. And one of those 6 months was where the rug was pulled out from underneath them, really. And they then sacked them because we didn't do very well. You can't constantly blame the sacking on the recruitment. It's as simple as that. I think Conioli, who was once at Liverpool, once said you need about a 60% success rate, arguably. Because you do buy so many players that you kind of need to aim for that, because some won't work, some will be a longer term thing that will work. Jordan Henderson was his prime example.
I mean, Brighton's a great example of that as well. The amount of players, I saw it the other day, the amount of players have actually brought in, and some of them have now been moved on. You probably wouldn't have even remembered, but the ones that have worked and stuck, you will remember. And that is probably around a 60% mark as well. So, yeah.
Exactly. And you have to understand, you have to be willing to accept the failures, because when you will have those failures, you'll learn from those, you'll then improve to get the next one. But also it's that when you have those successes, like we've seen with Brighton, they took the chance on Cucurella, they went out and bought Saicedo, McAllister, they bought all of these players for about 15 million, sub 15 million pounds each.
Yeah.
And now they're going to be sold between 50, 60 to 80 million pound mark. So you can't also look at just one window, because one window you may have a terrible window in that period, and maybe for 2 years, maybe one or two of those players don't progress for 2 years.
Yeah.
But then when they do, they become a player that you then really kind of move forward with. So my concern is that if we bring in a director of football, what then happens is if we have a bad window again, then what happens? Do we then pull up all the trees again? Because basically our board is knee jerk, and they're concerned with the bottom line. If they think we've lost money or we're losing money, immediately people need to go. Maybe apart from the manager, because that one is probably the biggest cost center to go.
Yeah. So in terms of, we did touch on it before on our live stream last night, actually, around where is this coming from? Who is pushing for this director of football role? Is it coming from Sullivan himself, or is it actually coming from the other side of the board in Krasinski? And that could maybe hint to a change in the ownership this summer and a change of, the positions. But what it mentioned in the actual article is the search for the director of football is actually being led by David Sullivan. It's coming from him. And he's the one that's been reaching out to these intermediaries and remains the most influential figure at the club. That the co-owner will take charge of finding a manager as well if Moyes leaves. So from this basis, it
David
looks like
Sullivan could have wrote that better himself, could he?
It's difficult to kind of say if this is 100% true, but it looks like it's coming from Sullivan.
That whole extract feels like an absolute ego massage. I have taken, as David Sullivan, an executive decision in which to bring in a fully qualified and accredited and well-respected director of football. I am the most powerful man at West Ham, and I have the say of what goes on.
Yeah.
Fuck off. Like, seriously, that whole piece is just a massaging of ego, and to make it sound like we have a plan. We don't have a semblance of a plan. We just have gone for, I don't really like Newman, I don't necessarily have as much of a say with Newman and Moyes, so I need to strip one part of it out or both parts out. That's essentially how I read that. Is I've lost control, or at least a say in what gets done in transfers. I've become the bank, and I don't like that. I want to have at least a say in that. And with Newman and Moyes' stipulation was that he has to have the final say and kind of sign off. It moved too slow. He didn't get as much of a say as he probably wanted.
Yeah.
And now he's looking to disrupt that, create some discourse. And by doing that is getting rid of Newman and bringing himself more into the fold.
Sure. And I think that's spot on. I think the word control is in Sullivan's vocabulary more than enough. So when we kind of look at all of this, the direction it's heading, what it means for Noble, there's actually now candidates been coming out, and there's been 4 or 5 that have been released in this article, and there's a couple that have definitely caught your eye and my eye as well. And that is we can take a look here who it has been. It's the former Liverpool sporting director Michael Edwards, Monaco's Paul Mitchell, even Brentford's Lee Dykes, and Atalanta's Lee Congerton, and obviously discussions with Victor Orta as well, who's just part of Leeds, but that'll be unlikely. So from that, there's 2 big standouts. There's Paul Mitchell of Monaco, who stated he is going to be leaving at the end of the season. And there's the former director from Liverpool, which is Michael Edwards. Starting with Paul Mitchell, why is that an exciting one? Why is that one that means that it's progression rather than just a random appointment to you?
Yeah, so Paul Mitchell's had an interesting career. He kind of started off, was a player, kind of played for Milton Keynes Dons, went on to be their youth scout before becoming their chief scout. Between the years of 2008 to 2012, went to Southampton as a scout there, then Tottenham as their head of kind of youth, before then getting the kind of the bigger gigs, where he went then to Red Bull in 18-19 season, whereas their head scout for Leipzig. One of the players of note he brought in during that period, or was involved with, was Ibrahima Konate. Now, you may recognise that name because he's now at Liverpool. He bought him on as a free transfer as an 18-year-old. They subsequently obviously sold him, funnily enough, to Michael Edwards' Liverpool team that he was in charge of at that time for 40 million quid.
Oh,
So,
wow.
you know, that's one example of a player that he's kind of brought in there. And, you know, he then, from being that head scout, they then sent him off to America to essentially oversee both New York Red Bull and I believe the team is Bragantino, who is the Brazilian arm as well. So he was the technical director for both those teams for a year. And then has since gone to Monaco. And again, he's smart in the market and smart in what he goes for, in that he, you know, sold Badiashile to Chelsea for £38 million. Tuchemeni went for 80 million to Real Madrid, brought in the likes of Mo Camara from Red Bull Salzburg. Yeah, Salzburg even, for like 15 million quid, brought in Bolo, got Newball, the German goalkeeper who Bayern signed, got him on a 2-year loan deal. Ishmael Jacobs is a good quality left back. Diassi, who we've looked at, bought in for 15, 13, 14 million quid. Now looking probably selling for about nearly 60 million, 50, 60 million quid. So in that period he's been at Monaco, they have spent 147 million or 141 million, brought in over 200 million, and basically they've made a net profit of 62 million pounds in the 2 years he's been there.
I mean, that does sound promising, especially with the summer project we're going to have coming in for this director of football. It looks like we're going to get quite a bit of funds from Declan Rice. Now, not all of that probably will go on transfers, but we're going to have to be smart with how we use that money, because like we mentioned last summer, like we mentioned the summer before, it's a big rebuild and there's a lot of positions we need to be filling, and not just filling, but competing with. We need to have, you know, 2 players in each position that are arguably competing for that first 11 spot and not just a filler, because that's when you get the dangers of things like what happened at the weekend with Brentford and why Moyes has probably been reluctant to use some of these players. So that does sound like a very interesting appointment. What about Michael Edwards of Liverpool, the former director there?
Yeah, so Edwards started off his career as a chief analyst at Portsmouth, funny enough. He was there for a good few years from 2003 to 2009. Again, another one who went to Tottenham, chief analyst there for 2009 to 2011, before going on to Liverpool as their chief analyst. He was there from 2011 to 2013 as their analyst. Then he moved to, as described by Transfer Market, a role called head of methodology, which he was there for 2013 and 15. I think that was really what it was looking to define as to what types of players, how they work from an analytical point of view, and basically trying to set the groundwork for end up being the work he did from 2015 to 2022 onwards. You know, in that period, he brought in some brilliant players. If you really think about it from a Liverpool perspective, got them to bring in Milner on a free, signed Joe Gomez from League One for £5 million, took the gamble, on Wijnaldum and Robertson by signing them from then relegated teams for, about 30 odd million pounds collectively. Mane, Salah, Van Dijk come in, bought in the likes of Solanke for free and sold it for 25 million.
Yeah.
Jota, Thiago, even Akawinia, who is at Nottingham Forest. They signed him for £1 million. They sold him for like £9 million later on. They've spent a lot of money, obviously, in that period. They spent nearly 750 million almost, but they've also accrued 577 million in that period. But when you think about it, in the time that he was there, they had a net spend. Obviously minus. So they actually have spent out 166.5 million pounds net spend. And that's obviously in a minus. But again, they've sold players like Coutinho for 135 million pounds at the time. Bought in Alisson as the world record goalkeeper signing and things like that. But you kind of go, oh, that's a lot of money to spend. But then when you break down the fact that in that period, whilst he was at the club, and also he was a very, very key figure in Jurgen Klopp coming in. He was the person who said, you need Jurgen Klopp.
Yeah.
And his team broke it down statistically to prove why Klopp was the man to bring in to the club, and also persisted with that. We need to give him time and give him money and get him the players. And, when you look at it, if it wasn't for Man City, they would have had a lot more, quite frankly.
Yeah.
They won the Champions League. They won the World Club Cup. They won the Premier League. They won the Super Cup. They won the FA Cup and League Cup. So Liverpool have been incredibly successful with Edwards because of the groundwork he set, the insistence of going for someone like Klopp, who, I don't think they were too enamoured by him at first at FSG, the appointment of Klopp, but have since obviously seen incredible returns because they've won the league for the first time in, 19, 20 odd years.
Yeah.
And, won Champions League and so on. So they were becoming a bit of a middling top half team.
Yeah, seventh, eighth.
That point with Rodgers where they almost got there, but they were starting to not look like the top team that they are now. And, to replace the likes of Luis Suarez and to bring in Salah, who was arguably a bit of a risk at the time.
Yeah.
The ultimate improvement that Firmino had once you got the likes of Mane in, they were all just kind of these little jigsaw pieces. And it's kind of, if you've given the guy time to build, he will do that. And because he's so analytical and very much in the numbers, again, it's past the eye test kind of thing, because it's looking as to, this is what we need to do in which to fit what the manager needs. Therefore, I need players that can do X. I need players that can do Y.
Sure.
And everything is done with a long-term plan. I'm not saying that we would be a Liverpool if we brought in Edwards, but you would probably see more akin to what you're seeing at the likes of Brighton, where you're buying maybe not lesser players, but we're probably buying players that are on the cusp because we probably have a bigger budget, potentially.
Yeah.
We are going to then maybe sign maybe a little bit more ready player rather than one that we need to develop for 1 to 2 years before we start to see them. But Edwards is a really interesting one because of obviously the work he did at Liverpool, and the biggest transfer he's ever done at Liverpool was bringing Jurgen Klopp. Now, if you can get in a guy who can bring in a manager, yes, Klopp was brilliant at Dortmund, but again, if there was reservations at the club to sell that idea and then to also sell the idea of keeping him when they weren't doing as well at the start of his tenure, that demonstrates someone who is going to identify a manager that suits the club and then suits what they want to then bring in terms of players and so on.
Well, that's exactly what we need, isn't it? Both of those options, both Paul Mitchell and Michael Edwards, are kind of the type of personnel we need in director of football, because that is the direction we do need to progress in. It is that long-term planning. It is that smarter buys based on data, based on, like you mentioned, the XYZ factor. So it's going to be interesting to see what develops with this. Obviously, there are a couple other names that have been mentioned, so we will go into those in more detail if anything comes into it. But yeah, those two are the main ones we want to be focusing on. They're definitely the high-profile appointments, and it would be a statement of intent if we were to bring those kind of people into the club. So what do you guys think about this? Do you think it's an attempt from Sullivan to take back a bit more control of the club and transfers, or does it actually let us develop as a club a little bit more with some more infrastructure and actual structure in the club, which we've been pointing to for the whole of this season as well, just how much of a mess the structure is? And maybe this is just everything starting to come together, and hopefully this summer it will be that. So yeah, let us know what you guys think in the comments below about this. And yeah, if you've enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel. And Mike, until next time,
come on, you irons.